Hi, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, we wanted to quickly share an exciting event happening this weekend. The LGA, Lake George Land Conservancy, and the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, otherwise known as APIP, are partnering to hold a Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, or HWA, monitoring weekend. All weekend, from Friday, March 7th through Sunday, March 9th, we're asking volunteers to get outside and help us find out where HWA is in our watershed. This just means going for a walk or a hike on your favorite trailhead and trying to find this sneaky invasive. If you spot it, make sure to report it to APIP via IMAP Invasives. We have a link to learn how to use IMAP Invasives in our show notes. Before going out this weekend, you'll need to learn how to identify hemlocks in HWA. You have two options: an online training or a guided walk on Saturday, March 8th at 10 a.m. at the Buck Mountain Trailhead in Pilot Knob. During the walk, participants will learn how to identify hemlock trees and spot signs of HWA. For more details and to register, visit lakegeorgeassociation.org/events or click the link in our show notes. Now, let's jump into today's episode with an HWA expert and former APIP Executive Director, Tamara Van Ryn. Welcome back to another episode of the Lake Protectors Podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay Canay, and today with us we have Tamara Van Ryn. Welcome, Tamara.
Hello, Lindsay. It's great to be here.
Well, it's nice to have you. Why don't we jump right in? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you work.
Great. My name is Tamara Van Ryn, and I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I am the director of the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. So we call ourselves APIP for short. So if you hear me say APIP, that means the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And we are actually one of 8 partnerships for regional invasive species management all around New York State.
Okay.
So I serve the entire Adirondack region and actually up to the Canadian border, so about 7 million acres. And the work that me and my team do is we work on aquatic invasive species and terrestrial invasive species, as well as forest pests. So my background and my love is forestry.
Yeah.
And so I get to spend a lot of my time on forest pest issues, which is why we're here today.
Yeah. So we asked you here today to talk about the Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, which is a new invasive species that came to our area. I think it was 2020, which we'll jump into that a little bit, but why don't we start in general with what is an invasive species?
Right. So an invasive species is something that's not native to a region. And not just is it not native, but it actually causes harm in some way.
Yeah.
So when I think about it, people are like, oh, poison ivy, that must be invasive. We don't like poison ivy, but it actually is native. So that is not an invasive species. Something like a tomato.
Yeah.
So a tomato is not native.
Right.
But I don't think most of us would call it invasive. It's not causing harm. But if we get to something like Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, it is an insect that is not native to our area, and it causes economic harm and ecologic harm. There are also some invasive species like giant hogweed or wild parsnip that can also cause human harm.
Yeah.
They might actually they have a chemical in them that can burn your skin if your skin is exposed to sunlight after touching their sap. So we look at it as economic harm, ecological harm, or human harm.
I had an encounter with wild parsnip 3-4 years ago now, and it made me manic. It was terrible. It was basically like having poison ivy, but I've never reacted to poison ivy ever.
Yeah.
And definitely encountered it. But this wild parsnip was, otherworldly. And it took like a month to fully. So that's harm to humans. So invasive species, you can have something that's non-native, but in order for it to have that invasive tagline, fall under that category, it has to be causing harm to human, other plants, animals, the ecosystem as a whole, or economic.
Or the economics.
Yes. Yep. Okay. So Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, where is it from? Where is it actually native to?
Right. So I can talk about hemlock all day.
Perfect.
There are multiple species of hemlocks in a variety of places around the world.
Yeah.
So there are some Asian hemlocks. There's a Himalayan hemlock.
Okay.
There's hemlock on the west coast of the United States. And here on the East Coast, we have mostly eastern hemlock. And then further south in places like North Carolina, there's also something called a Carolina hemlock.
Okay.
Okay, they're very distinct species. Hemlock woolly adelgid is an insect that actually can coexist with hemlock in certain places. So in Japan, for instance, there are hemlocks that are alive in the woods and they have hemlock woolly adelgid, but there are natural predators of the hemlock woolly adelgid. And those trees have adapted to live and to thrive even though they have hemlock woolly adelgid. One of the things about our global world is that species move around and humans are usually the cause of that. So it's likely that the hemlock woolly adelgid that we have here on the East Coast, it is traced to the Japanese strain of hemlock woolly adelgid. And it's most likely that it came in on a nursery plant. Somebody got a pretty Japanese hemlock. They wanted to put it in their garden. It got through the inspectors at whatever port there was. It came to the U.S. around 1950, and then it hit the East Coast. Our eastern hemlock, our Carolina hemlock, had no defenses. So it has been gradually spreading its way up from the southeast, where it first got introduced, all the way up down to Lake George.
So migrating up north, and I know I've seen certain maps that you've had that show that little bit of migration, and it took several years to make its way up here from when it was first introduced on the East Coast all the way up. In Lake George area, 2020 was the first year that it was spotted.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So it's been in New York State for about 20 years. And in the area of the Catskills, we've already seen some hemlock mortality due to hemlock woolly adelgid. There's a lot of efforts to save some of the hemlocks in the Catskills. But we were always hoping that the Adirondacks would be safe. So let's just back up a little bit. The hemlock woolly adelgid, it's a small insect, and it's in the category of an insect like an aphid. So some people who have house plants might know, I got all those aphids all over my plant, right? So it's a little teeny insect like an aphid. It doesn't really like the cold. So there had been a theory as people who've been working on hemlock over the last few decades, places like the Adirondacks are safe. It's cold enough. They're not going to be able to survive over the winter. And different studies have been done. And one of those was showing that it doesn't really like it when it's, colder than 13 below. Okay. So up here, 25 below. We get 25 below days. Well, we used to get 25 below days. So I've looked at some of the climate data from the Albany area. And we've actually had over 13 degrees of warming over the last 50 years. So where it routinely would get to 25 below, now it's routinely getting to, 12 below, 13 below? The insect doesn't have an exact temperature, right? So the papers will show, 13 below, it doesn't really like living, but some will survive, right? And so those ones that survive are likely more cold tolerant. And so as we're seeing here, our winters are warming much more dramatically than our summers are. And the adelgids that are surviving through the winter are hardier. And they're perfectly happy to live in these climates, it turns out. So the first time that someone found hemlock woolly adelgid in this Lake George watershed was actually in 2017, and it was on Prospect Mountain. And it happened to be a researcher from Massachusetts who's quite familiar with hemlock woolly adelgid. And he was up on Prospect Mountain and said, I didn't know there was hemlock woolly adelgid here. I thought it would be too cold.
Wow. So just out recreating, hiking the trail, and they came upon it. Wow.
Yes. And so there was an all-out effort to treat those trees. They are treated with chemicals because that's the way to kill the hemlock woolly adelgid. To treat those trees, it was about 7 acres of trees that were treated at the time. Went back in 2018, no sign of it. 2019, no sign of it. 2020, no sign of it. And everybody who has been involved in this was feeling, like it's a little spot fire, right? Had the little spot fire, put it out, we're good. for now anyway. And then there was a camper on one of the island campgrounds in Lake George. And I love this story because this camper was from an area of the state that has hemlock woolly adelgid.
Okay.
And not only did this camper have an awareness of what is hemlock woolly adelgid, that camper knew how to use something called IMAP invasives.
Yeah.
So do you know what IMAP invasives is?
I do in part because we've had conversations before, but I also used it in college as part of my grad school. Like I had to do this capstone project looking for buckthorn. So we used it, and that's how we tracked it all through this one trail, was using IMAP and graphing it, or not graphing it, but using the GIS pinpoint so that we could create these maps to basically check out the density of the infestation.
Yeah. So we'll just take like a little minute and talk about IMAP because it's going to come up in our conversation. So New York State is amazing. We have this statewide database where anybody, you just on your phone, can put information into this statewide database called IMAP Invasives. You find it at newyorkimapinvasives.com or .org.
And it's an app?
It's an app.
Okay.
So the easiest way to do it is to set it up on your desktop.
Yep.
But then I just use it on my phone all the time. So it's just an app and really simple to use. And the idea behind it is that you have community scientists, volunteers all over who can just enter data.
Right.
And if you think something looks like a plant or a bug or something that might be invasive, you put in your point and it reads the GPS location off your phone and you snap a photo of it. And then there's a whole bunch of people behind the scenes who get an alert.
Okay.
And they will look at that photo and either confirm, yep, that's definitely that species, or not confirm, nope, didn't have that one right, but that's okay. No bad on that. It just becomes an unconfirmed account. And if something needs further survey, it helps people know where to go to do some additional surveys. So why is that so important? Because, again, I serve an area of 7 million acres, right? I can't possibly get out there. We've got a staff of 4.5. How are we going to get out across all of this area? So dial back to summer 2020. You got somebody camping out on one of these islands in Lake George, and they happen to see this thing. It looks like hemlock woolly adelgid, and they think, oh, that's interesting. Well, I'm just hanging out here camping. I'm going to open my IMAP invasives, drop a point, take a picture of it. And because it's a species that we're actively tracking and watching, a whole bunch of people, me included, folks in New York State DEC, get alerts. It's like, ooh, hemlock woolly adelgid
so on
may
the back
be found.
End, you see that,
we
and
see
it's like major red flag.
Major red flag. And we're like, oh, yeah. And so within a day, there were people out on that island from the state, and then confirming that, yes, indeed, it was hemlock woolly adelgid. And that spurred an entire survey effort all along the Narrows and along the area of what we call Paradise Bay. And with a lot of professional survey effort based on that one volunteer observation, we found a very significant infestation of hemlock woolly adelgid that we were able, and I say we because it really is a community effort here in Lake George. We is APIP as one of the state's partnerships for regional invasive species management. It's DEC. We're all working together. The New York State Hemlock Initiative, lots of people are involved in this effort. So in this case, because it was on state forest preserve land, in 2020, the state was leading the effort to try and figure out, well, how much of it is here? But they had volunteers from a whole bunch of different organizations out there. Over 300 days of staff time was spent in 2020 to map that infestation and then to also start treating the trees there to try and save them. But none of that would have happened. Or it might have happened, but it could have been a year later or later, and that could have gone on unchecked if somebody hadn't said, I know what that is.
That community member knew what they were looking at and then was also a community scientist who had the app on their phone to put that in on the back end. So it could be moving that fastly. Wow. Yeah, that's pretty incredible.
Yep.
So 4 years down the road, from 2020 to now, the infestation, of course, has spread to certain. I mean, that's just the nature of it. You know, there's only so much that you can do. And in the Lake George watershed, the vast majority is covered in hemlocks.
Right. Yeah. So if I had pretty pictures here, we could talk about what are hemlock trees, but I would imagine that most of your viewers have some idea of what hemlock is. And when you think about the iconic shorelines around here, the mountainsides, those islands, so much of it is hemlock trees. And we're in an area where sometimes 60, 70, 80% of our forests here are hemlock. When I talk to some of my colleagues in other parts of the state, they're like, yeah, we can, if we go out, we can go on our property, we can find a few hemlocks. I'm like, I can walk out the door and I can't even count how many hemlocks I'm seeing today.
I was going to say, you can walk, if you aren't familiar with a hemlock, you could probably walk outside and walk within a very short distance.
And you would see a hemlock.
Absolutely faced with several of them, so including in the parking lot. So as far as identification, I mean, that one volunteer was able to identify it quite quickly. How can anybody else identify it? What should they be looking for on their hemlocks?
Right. So in the springtime, hemlock is, so folks who think about the hemlock branches, they're green, they're an evergreen, but they're sort of feathery. They're very different from the pines, which have these clusters of longer needles. These are the short feathery needles. And in the springtime, they'll also put on their kind of new growth for the year, and it's super bright green.
Yeah, we love it.
Yeah.
You always can tell when things have popped, and it does seem to go overnight.
And even today, I was out in the woods near here, and there's some of the tips are still green. So, they start greening up in May and they're green all the way through July. So if they've got those healthy green tips, then they're not likely to have hemlock woolly adelgid on them. If you're trying to actually find the adelgid itself, fall is a good time to do that. And how this insect works is that I should have brought a hemlock branch in with me because that would be easier because I'm very much a show and tell. But you've got your hemlock needles are coming into your branch. And so the adelgid is going to kind of land itself right where that needle attaches to the branch. And then it's got a very long mouth part that it basically sinks into that branch. And that's how it's going to start feeding. Right? And so a couple things are happening at that point. The adelgid thinks, whew, I'm here now. They get here.
The nutrients.
Right. They get here at about this there's 2 generations a year, but this generation is now mid-July coming in. It's settling in. It says, oh, it's going to be here for the long winter. I'm going to start spinning some wool around me. Right. And that's where the woolly part comes. So I'm going to spin some wool around me. It's going to take me a good 3 or 4 months to get myself nice and wrapped in this wool. In the meantime, I'm just going to continue sucking and feeding on this hemlock branch. But I'm going to spin all this wool around me because that's going to keep me warmer through the winter. And I'm going to lay my eggs in there for the spring generation, and it's going to protect those as well. So one of the things that you can look for, especially as then they're just settling in right now, they're the size of maybe a quarter, like half of a poppy seed. You're barely going to see teeny tiny little black speck. Unless you're looking out there like with a magnifying glass, or your eyes are really attuned, you're not going to find them. But ones that have been, but that wool does persist, right? So I was out.
A bit more of an easy eye catcher.
So I can go see last year's wool. That's all still very evident. But what you're looking for, what I'm going to do if I'm going out surveying is you're going to look on the underside of the branch. Just walk out. Here's a hemlock branch. I'm going to flip on the underside of the branch. I'm going to look and see, do I see these little specks of wool? They look almost like a small bit of Q-tip. Like little, not
a little bit of cotton.
Little bit of cotton, right? And you're going to see them right where the branch tip and the needle come together.
Okay.
And usually there's more than one. Sometimes if you see something that looks like, ooh, I think that looks white, and it's sitting in the middle of the needle or it's sitting on the middle of the branch and it's the only one there, chances are it's a spider egg sac.
Okay. Yeah.
Or it might have been a spittlebug that was out there or something. But really, once you really have a full infestation of hemlock woolly adelgid, you're going to see a little row of these along along that branch stem. So that's going to be the easiest way to see it. You'll also see it if you're looking at hemlock trees that have had the adelgid for a while. You're going to, in the spring, see that it doesn't have any of those green tippy branches, or it's going to die from the tips of the branches in. Mm-hmm. It's really different than how some of the other insects that harm trees work. In this case, again, because that insect has put its mouth part in and it's sucking right there on that branch tip. What the tree's doing, it's say, ooh, I'm in trouble. I have a wound. It's almost like, like your body is going to wall off that wound. Yep. It's going to try and wall that off. So it means that water is no longer going to flow up and down that branch, and food is not going to flow up and down that branch as it's dying off. And so it's kind of dying from the tips in because the adelgids are moving out to that fresh green tips each year to try and feed.
From the time of infection, how long does a tree have if it's not treated?
I like to say this is the good news story of hemlock woolly adelgid.
Okay.
You got to look for hope where you find it, right?
Yeah.
So, it's not going to die in a year, maybe 3 years, maybe up to 10 years.
Okay.
It may depend. So when we look through places like the Catskills, areas that are on the southernmost slopes that are kind of drier and also more exposed to stresses, they are going to have hemlock woolly. They're going to die earlier. The ridge tops will die earlier. Some trees can hang on for a decade.
Yeah.
What we found in the South, where it really has hit hard, is by the time that decade has passed, most of those trees are dead. In the Catskills, there are still cold hollow pockets, riparian pockets, lower elevation pockets that are still alive and hemlock.
Is there a point of, okay, this tree's infected, we can treat it? Is there a point of no return with a tree where you just say, oof, it might be too far beyond and too many of these branches have died where we might not be able to actually save this one?
That is a great question. I haven't read papers on that particular topic. I know that complete defoliation, hemlock won't survive.
Right.
Even at like 80% defoliation, like we saw with the spongy moth a few years ago, those hemlocks really struggle. Okay. 50% defoliation, a hemlock can come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Right. So when we saw that spongy moth infestation that a lot of people were rightly very concerned about a few years ago, in some cases, those spongy moths would strip pine trees. They were stripping the hemlock trees. Yeah. The pines were able to bounce back because you can completely defoliate a pine tree in 1 year. But if it's early enough in the season, they can bounce back. Because hemlock doesn't have a way to re-sprout during the growing season. It's going to put on its growth over the winter and be ready to sprout in the spring. It can't redo that in August or September, the way a pine might be able to at least get out a few shoots. The hemlock, if it's fully defoliated or really heavily defoliated, is not going to come back the next season.
Okay. Why don't we talk about why hemlocks are important? We know they're all over the Adirondacks, but why hemlocks? What is so special about them?
Right. Hemlocks are this amazing tree. We consider them what's considered a foundation tree in a forest. So what does that really mean? It's that hemlocks occupy a unique ecological niche. It's something that no other tree in this forest actually has that same role and function. So what do I mean by that? The hemlocks, I like to think of, there's actually two species here in the Adirondacks that are foundation species. It's hemlock and beech. And hemlock and beech make up about 25% of the forest volume here across the entire Adirondacks, right? All the counties of the Adirondacks. But here in the Lake George watershed, the hemlocks it is much more heavy to hemlock.
Yeah.
And people will also know there's a lot of beech as well.
Yeah.
So when I think about hemlock, especially the kind of dense, beautiful stands of hemlock that we have here, I think of hemlock as being the structure or the walls, right? Hemlock is what is keeping us cool in the summer. So if you've had a chance, if you've got lakefront property, but you've got a nice dock and it's got some shade cast by one of these beautiful shoreline trees, it's likely to be a hemlock tree. But if you're walking in the woods, our woods are much cooler, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So they're keeping us cool in the summer. And that's really important because we have so many feeder streams here that are feeding into the lake. But those feeder streams are also sometimes habitat for our trout species are cold water species.
Yep.
So the hemlocks are helping to keep us cool, especially in the summer, and particularly shading all those stream sides. Because they're often found on the hillsides, they're also basically our floor. They're keeping our forest floor intact. They're keeping our soil here. If you were to remove all of those hemlocks from the hillside rapidly, you'd see a lot more erosion. You'd see a lot more runoff. You'd see these streams turning muddier and warmer and not able to support those cold water fish.
Well.
Yeah. And then in the winter, it's almost the flip, right? They keep us warmer.
Yeah.
And so people who are avid outdoors people, or if they're hunters, they'll know that they often see the deer bedding down under the hemlock trees in the winter because that's where they're more sheltered. And we like to think of the hemlocks too. They're sort of for the deer in particular, the constant food source, right? Because as the snow levels get higher and the deer can walk higher on the snow, they can reach more hemlock branches and keep eating.
Yeah.
But they're really important, again, as sort of our floors and our wall and our ceiling. And there are some species that will eat hemlock branches, mostly deer. Beech, on the other hand, which is a species that a lot of people, sort of an underappreciated species. It doesn't have a lot of commercial lumber value or pulp value for pulp and paper. But beech provides food, beech nuts, right? Beech provides food for hundreds of species in our forests. It's serving, its flowers serve pollinators and insects. Bears love them because beech nuts are already starting to fall. And you can also imagine where our bears are going to be this winter as we have a good beech crop. So those are the two species that are most important here in terms of keeping our forests the way, serving the kind of same function. Yeah. But back to hemlock, right? So it's our ceilings, our floors, our wall. Everything. It's what's holding this whole ecosystem together. And so if you were to lose that hemlock, a lot of people say, well, what's going to happen? So in other areas around the region, we'll see that sometimes maple will come back. We might see sugar maple come in. We might see red maple come in. But what do you think of with maples?
Maple syrup.
Right, maple syrup. That's great.
The pretty leaves in
the fall, and those leaves fall.
Yeah.
Right? So they're not going to provide a lot of cover in the winter.
No. No, they're bare.
They're bare. And they are helping to shade our streams, but not in the same way those dense hemlock branches are. The other things about some of those, particularly the maples, we'll go back to the friends of the deer. In this case, the deer love those little maple seedlings, so they're often going to munch them. And so the deer don't love hay-scented fern. So depending on how many hemlocks die real quickly, if you've got too much sunlight coming in or too heavy a deer pressure, you may not get trees coming back in. Around here, we're likely to see some black birch come back in. We're likely to see some maples come back in. And a lot of people say, well, what if you planted spruce? I'm like, you can. Spruce doesn't fill the same exact habitat. And it's a lot of effort to go in and plant. And spruce they've got a different root structure. They're not often growing as close to those stream banks.
Mm-hmm.
Their branches are not casting as much shade. So they offer some possibilities, but there's nothing that replaces hemlock.
Right.
So that gets us to the question, what do you do?
What do you do?
Right? And so right now, in this moment, the program that I operate and a lot of the people that I'm working with, we want to keep hemlock desperately.
Oh, yeah. And particularly in the Lake George watershed. I mean, that is what holds in our stream banks, the lakes. It helps filter out stormwater, everything before it gets to the lake and the streams.
And so we want to keep these trees. And what we know from other places that have been devastated by this forest pest is the way to keep these trees alive is to treat them with chemical pesticides. And on all public lands, that is done with certified pesticide applicators. That's what we recommend to private homeowners as well.
To hire
someone, a certified pesticide applicator to do that. There is currently one type of treatment a private landowner can apply on their own that is applied directly to the soil at the base of the tree. And there's more information about that on the New York State Hemlock Initiative website. But again, the best thing to do is to have a professional provide some consultation. And what we do know is that it works, right? These treatments will keep a tree alive. The literature and research in the other parts of the country are showing at least 7 years, sometimes potentially longer. If you go to Shenandoah National Park right now, they have about 33,000 hemlocks that are alive. They know because the only hemlocks alive in Shenandoah National Park are ones that have been treated.
Wow.
And so it's a cost-benefit analysis, if you will, but it's not, in my mind, a dollar cost. It's an ecological cost, right? So there's dollars involved as well. It's not cheap to do this.
No, but of course.
Right. So, we try and use a variety of tools in our toolbox. And right now, keeping these trees that are in our most like the areas that are keeping our streams the coldest, holding those stream banks together so we don't have a lot of erosion into the lake. Some of the iconic views, those are the ones that are important to keep alive. And the chemical treatments are not the end game, right? The end game is to develop hemlocks that are resistant to this pest, because we do know that there are hemlocks in other parts of the world that can coexist. And there's great research happening on the genetics of hemlock trees. And over my lifetime, we are going to find the solutions to HWA-resistant hemlock. The other is that, as I said in the beginning, these insects exist in other places, but they're kept in check by what you call predators. Of course, when you think of predators, what do you think of when I say a predator?
Something big and scary and like sniveling and
right. We got wolves, we got mountain lions, we got Sasquatch, whatever that may be, right? Right. So in the case of a little teeny adelgid, like a little teeny aphid thing, the
probably
predator,
not as big.
No, the predator might be a beetle. Or it might be a fly.
That's just a smidge bigger. Okay. But it's twice the size of the adelgid. Okay.
Right. So from that adelgid perspective, it's massive, really big and scary and all those things that we think of as a predator. So in other parts of the world, there are predators of this adelgid, even on the west coast of the United States. So we are really fortunate in New York State that the New York State Hemlock Initiative, which is funded in part by our Environmental Protection Fund, that's operated out of Cornell University, are able to rear these two different types of bugs that are predators.
The beetles.
The beetles and a silver fly, a type of fly. and they're able to rear these in a lab in Ithaca. It's all very controlled. It's not like they've got like some secret lab somewhere and something. Right. No. And it's all overseen through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And these species, there has to be extensive testing of any of these kind of species before they're released out into the wild. The beetles in particular have been released to the southeast for decades now. And it's really exciting because in places like North Carolina, those beetles have reproduced. We're seeing natural hemlock stands coming up. We will be able to see that they've got hemlock woolly adelgid, but they're growing and they've got beetle populations living symbiotically with them. It's like, all right, this can work, but it takes a while. So here in this area, the Hemlock Initiative out of Cornell has been able to release some of the beetles and some of the flies. And we're hopeful that those populations eventually will be able to take hold and spread. But getting these, think about the flies, like the folks from Cornell are going out to the West Coast. They're literally collecting these flies and bringing and shipping them back and trying to rear them and get them to reproduce and then to distribute. Yes. So it's not like you can just say, I'm going to just dial up myself 1,000 bugs today.
Place it on Amazon.
No, it's not like that. So again, the long game is to keep enough hemlocks alive to help our ecosystems and our economy. And to then be able to hope that these biological controls and resistant hemlocks will eventually populate our landscape. And so the chemical applications fit into that strategy as this short-term interim strategy.
Now, if a tree has been treated with the chemical control, can an aphid of the hemlock woolly adelgid still attach, or does it immediately die?
It doesn't like them.
Okay.
Right. So they can be treated. There are a few that will kind of land and persist, but they're not going to reproduce at the same rates.
In the way and have the effect on the tree. Okay. Wow. Great. That's a nice outlook, because typically when you hear there is this invasive bug, it's going to kill all the hemlocks, it's like, oh, this is life-altering, ecosystem-altering. So to hear that there are these, wonderful scientific tests being done, whatnot. And I'm sure the concern has been raised, but of course, this is what they would be looking into and part of their entire research is, okay, so if you're introducing another species, are there any adverse effects of that?
Right. And the research that has been done is not showing that there is a harmful impact to native insects from these particular beetles or these flies.
That's good.
Because it's all very carefully controlled. And again, you have to be looking at it from
like a trade-off. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you can save the hemlocks, that really is everything. They are the foundation of the ecosystem, really, particularly in our area. Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to also just touch on an issue that had come up, because people sometimes think of, I think of them as like our ecosystems, right? Because I'm a forest person, and I like to think about all the species that are dependent on these hemlocks. But I also wanted to flip it to the economic perspective for just a minute.
Yeah, of course.
So in this area, we do have an active timber industry as well as a pulp and paper industry. And so one of Finch Prine Papers, in Glens Falls, uses hemlock for some of its specialty papers. So it is important from an economic standpoint. And one of the things we also heard from our colleagues at places like the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is that if you have a lot of hemlocks die quickly, you end up with hazard trees, right? These are the trees that are overhanging your roadways or that may be threatening your buildings. So they actually ended up closing one of the roads in the national parks for 6 years because it was so impossible to keep up with the number of trees that were dead, that were falling on the road. They just couldn't keep getting out there and clearing the road and clearing the road and clearing the road.
Wow.
So when we think about, we're here in July, right?
Yeah.
We just had some recent very heavy storms and winds come through here.
That are taking down healthy trees.
And so when you think about, other impacts, even if you're not as concerned about the biological impacts or the water temperature or the water quality, the sheer economic impacts to our communities, if we have widespread hemlock mortality, and just in terms of keeping roads and power lines and clear, right? And driveways and your houses. So there's a lot of importance to being able to keep track of where this insect is, to try and use treatments where we can, and again, hope for those longer outcomes of resistance and biological controls. Yep. So again, thinking about protecting the lake, and I've talked a lot about, again, some of the chemical applications. The way that landowners, there is one particular way that they can get a particular chemical and they can apply it around the base of the tree. When professional applicators are doing it, they have two ways of doing it. One of the ways to do it is to actually use a spray wand and be very close to the tree, and you spray it right on the bark. And that's lower down on the tree. And there's a couple reasons for that. It's being taken right up by the bark, so you don't have a lot of soil impact. It's going on the bark right into the tree. Usually there's not a lot of branches down low. And so you're not worried about insects that may be on other branches. And if you have a professional applicator, they'll also make sure there's not like flowering shrubs nearby that may be harboring pollinators or other types of insects that would be harmed. So it's applied to a very narrow area right on the bark. The other thing is that if you're close to the water, you don't want to have any chance that this might drift because it is being sprayed on there. So you can actually inject the tree, which is kind of fun. It's like almost like an IV drip. You go out and you drill a hole in the base of the tree, a small hole through the bark, and then you have an injector, basically. It's not quite like a syringe, but it essentially is you're injecting the chemical right under the level of bark. And
a bit more direct.
It's more direct. It's much more labor intensive, and it is a little more expensive in terms of the chemicals that are used. But it is really important to know that if you have lakeside hemlocks, there are ways to do this in a way that doesn't, that is the safest for protecting the lake as well.
Absolutely. Now, as far as resources, like say they identify that they've got hemlock woolly adelgid on their property, or they think they do. They go through the process of mapping it on IMAP. It is confirmed that it is, and they want to reach out to these folks. Where are the resources? How do they figure out who to reach out to, who can come and treat the hemlocks?
Right. So, unfortunately, I guess, that within New York State, and I really think around the country, it's up to the individual homeowner to take care of things that happen on their property. So there's not some grand fund. There's not some crew that can just come and do that. On the APIP website, which is adkinvasives.com, there is a list of pesticide applicators that work in this region.
That's great.
And homeowners can talk to those applicators and find out what the treatment options are on their property. I will say that we don't recommend that you go out and start treating all your hemlocks. You want to know if you actually have hemlock woolly adelgid first. And again, the way to do that is just to take a look at some of those lower branches, turn them over. If you see those white woolly things, snap a photo of it, put it in IMAP. And if that'll either be confirmed fairly quickly if it's really obvious, or someone will be able to come out and help confirm that that's there.
Do a site visit.
And then the pesticide applicators are in the area are familiar with it.
Yeah,
and they can help develop treatment plans
quite quickly.
Yep.
Okay.
And on the state level, we have so much public land around here, right? So we think of all those islands that everybody loves. If you're looking out at Tongue Mountain, if you're looking at a lot of the hillsides or boating by Paradise Bay, that's all owned by all of us, right? As New York State. And the state does have some resources and has recently been able to hire a 2-person crew to help survey and treat just the hemlock woolly adelgid in this area. Okay. So we've got some dedicated resources that'll help take care of those public lands.
And you guys also have a program called Forest Pest Hunters as well. So that's meant for people who are out on the trails, not necessarily at their home, but out on public lands, wherever they might be recreating. If they spot it or any invasive, they can map it in IMAP and have it be a part of this program as well.
So if you go to www.adkinvasives.com, you can check, get involved. There's a drop down, how to volunteer. You can click on Forest Pest Hunters, and it's great. I mean, in its own way, it's great fun, right? But you can click on a map and pick a trail you want to survey. The survey protocol is pretty simple. We ask people to sort of walk for 10 minutes, stop and look at hemlocks for 10 minutes, record anything you find in IMAP, yes or no, is it here, is it not, and keep on going. So we also have that for a disease called beech leaf disease. Okay. We're launching our beech leaf disease Forest Pest Hunters soon. That'll be on August 7th of 2024. Great. So that'll be launched, but all the information and the recorded webinar will be on our website. Perfect. And if folks want to do hemlock woolly adelgid, we have last year's recordings on our website. We usually do that training in December or January because that's when it's easiest. That's when that wool is so bright. So you can find all of that on our website. And there's some good handy information in there too about just how to get an IMAP invasives account. So it takes a village to get all of this done. As I said, there's
large community.
A large community. We've had volunteers enter over 2,000 observations into IMAP invasives. So that gives us a great baseline of where is it not, where should we be most concerned about. And again, none of us could do that on our own. It's a collective effort.
Yeah. This has been wonderful. Such great information. Thank you so much for coming out and talking with us today, Tamara. We appreciate it. So thank you. We will link some of the information, and we'll definitely link to your website in our show notes so anybody can reach out and become a forest pest hunter, get their IMAP invasives, and be on the lookout. Hopefully they don't find it, but in case they do, they know exactly what to do.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk hemlock today.
Thank you so much. And stay tuned for another episode, guys. The Lake Protectors Podcast is a production of the Lake George Association. To check out the work that the LGA is doing, follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Lake George Association. You can also visit our website at lakegeorgeassociation.org. This episode was produced by Jacqueline Mignot. If you'd like to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.